Good morning on a day that already is promising to be rather warm. Right? I want to begin by thanking the Center of Hellenistic Studies at Simon Fraser University, the post-colonial series at Rutgers, the offices of the University of Rutgers for providing the financial means to make this event possible, combined financial means to make this event possible. But I also want to thank Irini and Sadia. I'm going to be using Arabic references, so that's why I slipped. Sadia for their really extraordinary and diligent and unwavering efforts at conceptualization, organization, and execution. I've done these things myself, including internationally. It's no easy task. And I have indeed noted the seamless movement of this process and very much appreciate the particularity of the venue we're in and its context. So, having made those remarks of thanks, I want to offer a very quick prefatory remark. This project, and then I have a preamble. This what I'm going to share with you is really a set of points, provocations that I hope will provoke conversation. It comes from a project that I have been working on rather explicitly under the rubric of imagination since 1990. But in fact, the prehistory goes back to 1970 when I was affiliated with the Black Panther Party, and in that context was introduced to two sources that have informed my thinking in a fundamental way, Mao Zedong and Frantz Fanon. And specifically, because I was charged with the task of the Freedom School, the idea that I was engaged with was the Maoist notion of the mass line and Fanon's notion of achieving a radical humanism and a way of thinking and doing something else. And I mean, that was my executive task, which meant it was always about the process of politicization or constitution of a revolutionary persona out of or with an oppressed people. And in that affiliation, the failure of that project, which prompted me to ask certain questions about what are the conditions of possibility of achieving such a sustainable, radical, revolutionary subject. And that failure led me into becoming a member of the American-based Maududiyite Islamic Party of North America, which a lot of radicals went into because it promised to achieve and was committed to the same project of transformation of the masses into a particular kind of revolutionary subjectivity. The failure of that project, which got involved in certain coup attempts in Latin America, I had left that party before that. I was kicked out before that happened, actually, led me to pursue studies as a fundamentalist scholar at Al-Azhar University, and we were indeed called fundamentalists at the time, and also Abu Lahya, fathers of the beard, where in the course of that career, the centrality of the question of imagination to these projects of politicization became clear to me. And this is when, at that point, it's 1979, I begin to probe the question. And by 1990, I've got a clear, coherent project. So that's the background of what I'm going to share with you today. That said, why empires without sovereignty? A question for these times. Now, I should say right off that the title of my talk is imprecise. Indeed, it is very vague, and in its vagueness, it is potentially misleading. It is in need of some refinement, which I shall undertake now by making it more precise. But in honor of Vangelis and the conversation yesterday, I shall do so in the privative. Ohi. By stating what it is not. First, it is not about empire. in contrast to the state, the nation state per se, which is the general tack taken by political philosophy and history when discussing sovereignty. That is to say, it is not about what Andreas Osiander describes as the still received doxa in the fields of international relations and law, that the 30 Years' War was a struggle between the medieval conception of imperial seiority and hegemony over Christendom, orbis Christiani, and the modern conception of a system composed of independent sovereign states, with the 1648 Peace of Westphalia enshrining the victory of the latter. Osiander further characterizes this notion of a transition from imperial preponderance, actual or at least claimed, to the system of mutually recognized sovereign states as myth. His analysis is rather persuasive, I think, and clearly informed, albeit without acknowledgement, by Foucault's critique of political theory's preoccupation with sovereignty at the expense of a more concrete analysis of how the historical articulations of power are constitutive of society as well as the state. And I mean by that as well, both his earlier analysis of power and his later one. And that analysis itself, or that critique, is resonant with Antonio Gramsci's earlier extended analysis of civil society and the state, an analysis that corrected Hegel's differentiation between the two. As I said, however, this is not what I wish to talk about or dwell on today, although it is a given point of reference, noting in passing that George H.W. Bush declared one of the primary objectives of the first Gulf War, Desert Storm, was formation of a new world order in which the community of nations sharing responsibility for freedom and justice was requisite for any legitimate claim of sovereignty. There has been in the fields just mentioned, international relations, political philosophy, political history, a constant reinterrogation of the viability of Westphalia as an historical event, as an idea, or a normative score sheet, to quote Richard Falk, since Bush made that announcement in September of 1990. And indeed, in ongoing analysis of the structure of power and polity taking place in these days that seem to emerge in these times. In that regard, I also note that this interrogation in international relations as well as political theory precedes Hartenegri's meditation, Empire, by a decade. From, as I say, the crises precipitated by Iraq's annexation of Kuwait, and indeed on to, I think importantly, issues that have to do with the formation of the European Union. And indeed, if we recall the work of Joseph Nye, it is a question that was prompted by the formation of the European Union. And I would say that the Rome Accords lead to this by addressing it as an economic confederation and never attending to the question of the structures of polity or culture, or how one produces a citizen, or the persona that is adequate to that conceived economic order. But let me adjust what I just said. It's not so much that the interrogation of the inadequacy of sovereignty as a political concept in international relations and political theory preceded Hart and Negri, but rather that their work on empire is in consequence, and their work brings the issue into the fields of the humanities. The point there is a simple one. In the fields of the social sciences, this question has been a burning question, clearly, since 1979. The humanities find it with Hart and Negri belatedly, right? And this has to do with structures of knowledge and how we don't pay attention to what's going on as a question of formations of intelligence. Be that as it may, let us presuppose F.H. Hensley's summation of Baudin's and Hobbes's definition of sovereignty, to wit, the idea that there is a final and absolute political authority in the political community, and no final and absolute authority exists elsewhere. Furthermore, most of the concern in political theory and international relations over the défaillance of sovereignty as conceptualization of power, is circumscribed. It is circumscribed by a worry about the relationship between two other political concepts: revolution, with its corollary concept, popular sovereignty, and empire. For our purposes here, revolution connotes the historical processes of civic republicanism that emerged in the Atlantic world in the 18th century, the three paradigmatic instantiations of which are the American Revolution of 1776, the French Revolution, 1790, and the Haitian Revolution of 1779 to 1805. Bolivarianism, being inspired by these, and indeed which people don't pay attention to, directly supported by Haiti in terms of military support and political support, and offering an exile haven for Bolivar. Which, by the way, Haiti being the first established republic to formally recognize the Republic of Greece. At various moments in the unfolding of these three paradigmatic civic republican revolutions, all three invoke the concept of popular sovereignty, postulating that the people who lived in a territory should determine for themselves the nature of their government. In its earliest expressed formulation, this postulate was a sort of legal and political fiction crafted in 1642 by barrister Henry Parker during the English Civil War in his Some Few Observations. It was subsequently elaborated, of course, by Hobbes, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Mills. In each of these formulations and elaborations, the sovereign people are invoked, however, to legitimate the representative authority of the emergent bourgeoisie as a governing class, governing over and against the divinely derived aristocratic monarchical authority. And this is an important point. We need to recall the difference between potestas, imperium, and auctoritas. Executive power, imperium; potestas, power, as in capacity, coercive power, and authority. And much of the struggle is going to be about authority. And we'll talk about this, I think, later in the conversation. Empire connotes a system of centralized administrative power, what the Romans after Augustus called imperius principate, which was only a titular, or has only a titular, territorial boundary. That is to say, while the center of power may be situated in a specific place, our examples of interest being Washington, D.C., Beijing, Moscow, with Brussels serving as an aspirational case. The application of power is expressly construed as the world. Right? The application of power, the unfolding of power, the instantiation of power, its actualization is the world. Not in the world, but is the world. Significantly, every one of the Atlantic revolutions declared itself, and relatively early on, as an empire. In his letter of December 25th, 1780, to George Rogers Clark, providing the mandate for Clark's Illinois campaign, this is when they opened up the Western Front and managed to conquer as far as Detroit. Thomas Jefferson writes, "We shall form to the American Union a barrier against the dangerous extension of the British province of Canada, and add to the empire of liberty, an extensive and fertile country." This call for the United States to actively extend the virtues of civic republicanism around the world was subsequently repeated as a matter of policy in a number of U.S. administrations, by Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, by Theodore Roosevelt and his cousin Franklin, by Wilson, by Harry Truman, by Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and both George H.W. and George W. Bush. And even although Obama, in his acceptance speech in November, 2008, phrased it in terms of countering any threats anywhere in the world to the United States' interests. That too was tantamount to the same imperial tendency. And if you paid attention to Obama's policy papers during the campaign, he spoke expressly about structures of hegemony to counter the then Islamicists' capacity to capture minds. The French Revolution, and of course, remember the speech, it's very important in Chicago. People don't pay attention. He got his greatest cheers when he was being the most bellicose. Right? So he announced what became his actual policy, which was the exercise of empire through military might. The French Revolution quickly moved from defending itself against counter-revolutionary invasion to the aggressive conquest of the world as the best offense. And having declared establishment of the Republic of Haiti on April 28, 1804, in his capacity as its first president, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, then on September 2nd, 1804, declared l'Empire d'Haïti, Empire and Haiti, the Empire of Haiti. Equally as significant as these revolutions' common imperial tendency is the fact that only one of them, the United States, has achieved in good measure that goal and continues to proclaim itself the supreme administration of the world system. And it does it both economically and militarily, right? That's its explicit role. And symbolically, the whole crisis about the withdrawal of the US from the world system it helped forge. And there's an interesting backstory of that. We lose sight of the fact that McKinley, when Roosevelt was Secretary of the Navy, took Albert Mahan's conceptualization of an American imperium and made it a reality. And Mahan realized that the railroads had been completed by 1898. And so the United States was a kind of continental expanse that had no borders, only frontiers, and that you could conceive the extension keeping going around the world. And so, in what they presented Mahan as an anti-imperialist project was the project of establishing sites in which the imperial power, the force of Navy, could move at the drop of a hat to secure the seaways. I mean, you can clearly see this is taken from the British imperial policy, but also industrializing it in a powerful way and working against the British in the intervention in China at that time by insisting on open trade, right? And creating the world as its system. And they're very clear about this. America is the world, right? And this is where the issue of imagination becomes important. And this is how America sees it. We are the world, right? And we're no longer even thinking, we see this under Trump, in terms of the geographical terra, but it can expand cosmically, right? So it's an explicit cosmological imperial conceptualization, as all empires have been. We shall attend more carefully to this fact in a moment, as well as the simultaneous claims of global imperium by their distinct polities. Each engage in expansionist policies create not so much a society of boundary states as multiple sites of contact between expanding imperial frontiers. It could be said then that my concern is the imperial tendency that I've just described, or what we might call socialization of the market, meaning the processes of neoliberal globalization whereby the only tenable norm of general subjectivity is a function of speculative market value, the dynamics of high capitalist finance, as the absolute measure not just of human progress, but existence as well. And so the economy of consumption and desire and consumption, has been the sole determinant of what and how we are. Yet, while the market, or the capitalist market to be more precise, and I mean throughout its history, from the early commodity markets of Northern Europe in the 10th century to the current economy of global finance, may indeed have engendered the normative subjectivity of the market through its endless refashioning and management of desire and imagination, it has also engendered something else. This something else is what Zygmunt Bauman termed an aesthetic sociality. The spontaneity of subjective feeling into volatile and unpredictable occasions of consensus. As he says, the instantaneous sociality of the crowd is a counter structure to socialization's structures. I say it is an interruption in the market-driven processes of socialization. And this interruption holds the promise of what Fanon referred to 59 years ago in his aspirational analysis of the potential of the Algerian Revolution as doing something else. This gets generally paraphrased, of course, as neo-humanism, but I prefer to call it radical humanism, meaning a humanism predicated on something other than the transcendental self behind the subject, or behind subjective, as well as objective idealism, being the articulation of a distinctly different epistemology from that of the bourgeoisie, even in the latter's revolutionary articulations. The experience of the Algerian Revolution, however, teaches that this radical humanism also means, or also remains, as Bauman recognizes, susceptible to the managerial strategies of the state. Perhaps then Algeria is not the best model after all, because despite Aban Ramdan's and Fanon's heroic efforts to make it such, it was not a popular-based and led struggle in the way Tunisia has been, or for that matter, Sudan is right now. Then again, given the uprising that is taking place in Algeria for the past 6 months, in which placards have appeared with slogans from Fanon, the issue may still very well be at play there. Looking not only at Algeria, but also Sudan today, and for that matter, the still vital energies of movements like Black Lives Matter, or even the earlier 2005 Émeutes de Banuel, the riots of the ghettos, it seems as though, which by the way didn't peter out when I was in France last May, right, during the student riots, there was tension even on the streets between those Banuelistes and the white students who were complaining about having applied to them austerity measures that had been applied to immigrants for some time. And that had to do precisely with, as François Vich pointed out quite eloquently from the podium, France's refusal, especially on the left, to even recognize its colonial history. And so there's no capacity to think about these issues as they play out on the ground today. Anyways, it seems as though the very real capacity of spontaneous intelligence of the people to create, to generate new forms of sociality is not totally comprehended by the market-based processes of socialization. And indeed, that capacity remains possible. This spontaneity is precisely what Badiou has in mind when he states regarding the Tunisian Revolution that these times are le temps des émeutes, the times of riot. Les temps des émeutes, the era or the times of riots. According to Badiou, the riots in Tunisia are a specific historical rarity in that their transition from an immediate localized uprising into a historical riot with, to quote him, the promise of a new long-term temporality, gradually outlining a unified representation in mosaic form of all the people, were fairly rapidly victorious. Events such as Tunisia and Sudan, and also just this past week in Hong Kong, contradict the fin de l'histoire, the end of history, neoliberal thesis of globalization that postulates le fin de l'événementalité historique, the end of eventful history, the end of a moment where the organization of power could be overthrown in favor of, as Trotsky said, the masses entering on the stage of history. Badiou somehow grasped this, declaiming, what is fascinating above all else in the Tunisian events is their historicity, providing demonstrative evidence that the capacity to create new forms of collective organization is intact. And in drawing attention to the historicity of the Tunisian events, he highlights two remarkable aspects of those events. which they're indicative of, but not unique. That the masses espouse the values of civic republicanism without the vanguard leadership of the elite. Even the syndicalist leadership played a supporting role to popular insurrection. As a result, the new forms of collectivity emerged in the course of the revolution in contestation with the market-driven processes of social formation, compelling the question, what are the conditions of possibility for the sustainable articulation of the creative revolutionary subject? Now, before I go into the last stage of the talk, I want to make a note that's important. The counter-revolutionary forces against this dynamic, which is still going on, supported by Adenauer Foundation, the Freedom House, conservative Western entities, Qatar, has sought to correct this. Yeah, has sought to correct this by putting in place technocrats. Technocracy becomes the achievement of stability. Now we come then to the principal shift in my refinement of title, which is the abandonment of the term sovereignty, or more precisely, the political concept it denotes, for the term popular sovereignty. But that term itself is a corollary of the political concept of national sovereignty, something I've just said I won't talk about. What was indeed most disturbing about the spontaneity of riot is its manifestation of a dynamic, non-contractual sociality, the aesthetic sociality Bauman refers to. The riotous nature of that sociality, its capacity to violently disrupt the constituted political order, is not arrested or otherwise dissipated by the instituting of a constitution. The continual insurrectionism of the multitude evidences the untenable fiction of Hobbes's proposition that sovereignty by institution, that is, the social contract, is permanent and irreversible. So there must be further refinement here in my title. An additional displacement of sovereignty with voice. While the phrase popular voice would seem to suggest the political concept vox populi, and it does, but not in the generally received notion of the voice of the people as the legitimate source of political authority. That would be no shift in thinking at all, merely an alternative expression of the modern concept, popular sovereignty, which, again, in the United States, is interesting. That term and that concept gets used in a very powerful way in 1854. Calhoun introduces it to legitimate slavery. Right? It was part of the debate of what states can come into the Union. And so the argument was that the locals can determine what their norm is, which has been revived in Make America Great. Right? And of course, Nixon picked this up in what he called the Southern strategy. Right? And it's important that he's making these announcements. Reagan's announcing his campaign from Philadelphia, Mississippi. These are all rather transparent codes. Right? So when we talk about popular sovereignty in America that's being spread around the world, we're talking about spreading white supremacy as a matter of policy and institutionally and discursively. Right? And one of the amazing things about America is we can say these things, but because we have the myth that we're good and we're innocent, there's an innocence to our natural supremacy, which of course is what makes it attractive for many people, and hence they imbibe this discourse and reorient their whole lives around a very particular Kantian notion of raciology. So that would be merely an alternative expression of the modern concept popular sovereignty, which is what I've abandoned. No, I mean to invoke vox populi in precisely the sense Alcuin meant when he wrote to Charlemagne in 1798. Necodendi solent detire vox populi, vox die, cum tumultuositas vulgi insaniae proxima sit. Those who insist on saying the voice of the people is the voice of God should not be listened to. For the riotousness of the masses is approximate to madness. That is to say, I mean the riotous in the sense of anarchic, disruptive, transformative voice of the multitude. spontaneous. The relation of populi, people, to vulgi, masses, is mediated by voice, but not in the sense meant by Henry Parker or that postulated by Hobbes and Rousseau. In other words, not in the sense of the hermeneutics of the powerful, of the virtuous and excellent, through whom the otherwise voiceless masses become articulated as a party of politics. The voice of which I speak is not a cacophonous noise transformed into reasonable speech through the action of civil discourse. Rather, it is multiplicitous articulations of conflict over the terms of order and distribution. The invocation of Al-Suin's letter to Charlemagne brings us back to the question of empire, only not at its dissolution in the nation state, but rather at its emergence as a new world order. Arguably, there are two viable empires today, each one grounded in conceptions of civic republicanism. We are living in the world in which these two remarkably functional imperium, the aforementioned United States Empire of Liberty, and the PCR, whose One Belt, One Road policy emulates the US policy of expansion in the world laid out by Mayhem, are organizing our planet. Now, I'm going to wrap things up here rather quickly, because what's at stake in these contestations, I think I've already indicated in my remarks, is precisely the question of what kind of persona can not only be articulated in structures of imperium, but can be articulated in a way that is sustainable within those structures and sustains those structures. And so it's no small matter that for both China and the United States, the explicit revolutionary project has been not only to change their immediate local circumstances, but to change the world. And to change the world through the production of a new kind of person. People didn't pay attention, but significantly during the second Bush administration, the neocons were very much enamored with the party's for our policy and thought they could turn Protestantism to a kind of discourse akin to Mao's mass line. And Mao's mass line, to explain that quickly, was something he used during the 40s to organize the people. And it was the postulate that, and the activity, it was an action, right? That the people ought to become a source of their own authority in political structure. And you do so by sending out cadres to solicit from the people their complaints and questions. And in the act of soliciting, spontaneously organize those people who are speaking as local cadre themselves, right? Send that back up to the party so that the party then can re-articulate those demands back to the people in the political terms of the party, which the people then take up an exercise. So the mass line is about the authority coming from the masses back to the masses, mediated through the operation of the party. Hence my remark about the books being that mediation. And in that process, constituting the revolutionary person. Indeed, in order to understand what's at stake in the Chinese Revolution, this is a version of a paper I gave in September in Beijing at Wang Hui's Center of Humanistic Studies on the question of sovereignty. And in that debate, it was an amazing experience for me because Chengsheng University, which became a site of a great deal of agitation between young communists in the party and lots of arrest, I was privy to a conversation that's been going on since the 19th century. And this is how they frame it. And the conversation is about Ren, and I'm going to explain this. What is the human? Expressly, right? And the history of defining the human as being central to the revolutionary project. And these theories of Ren really are definitive for what the revolution becomes, and they go back to classical problems in the 19th century of how to address the transition from one moment of imperium that's gone on for 5 millennia in the wake of an emergent Western imperium. And indeed, that conversation of Ren was part of the discussion around the United Nations discourse of human rights, in which the Chinese representative tried to interpolate into the language in English this conceptualization of Ren. I'm going to give you some general outlines. But one of the particular things about Ren is it's a divided persona, as the anthropologists would call it. It never indicates an individual alone, but it's always an individual relationally. Somebody's brother, somebody's father, somebody's sister, somebody's mother, somebody's uncle. All of that constellation, that dynamic, is invoked with the term and hence with the individual. Now, this is a key concept in the ancient Chinese thought. In fact, there's a saying, 习在人为, everything depends on human effort, right? And another commonplace saying, 谋习在人, 成绩在天. The plans are made by humans, while the results depend on heaven. The creation of a new China, then, had to begin with redefinition and recreation of the Chinese person. 中国人, without the new Chinese person, a new China would be politically impossible, as would be the greater goals of this new China, which was to conquer the world, to redefine the world, to make the world. Again, it's an imperium. As even this summary description suggests, in the Chinese revolutionary vision, the term human, Ren, entailed several distinct senses. The human as a member of mankind and as an oppressed individual, for example. Above all, however, this human was Chinese. And that's still a big debate. What is Chinese? Right? And one of the aspects of the debate is the notion of Min, the non-Han. Right? And if you're going to have this kind of notion of the individual always instantiating a multiplicity, how do you deal with differences of those multiplicities? Right? And this comes to the question of source of ultimate authority. So above all, this human was Chinese, a constituent of a new China community. And the antiquity of this discussion is interesting. You go back to the Yin kingdom in the north that conquered the Song. And when they conquered the Song, they declared themselves Chinese. Right? You have all of these different ethnicities that declare themselves Chinese, including the Mongols. So what is Chinese connoting? Right? What it connotes is a profound abstraction, but not an abstraction of divinity, but an abstraction of the possibility of a humanity that is intricately interconnected in a perpetual movement of expansion and growth. Right? And in that sense, the ambition is to make us all Chinese, which is executed through the Confucian Institutes, right? Which my eldest child, I made her attend, right? And they're implementing it widely in Africa so that everyone speaks Putonghua, which itself is an abstract language that is the semiotic expression of this notion of Ren. Now, of course, what the party does, and I'm not going to go through all of the different 19th century thinkers who lay down the foundations of this by trying to adapt Ren to Mill's notion of individual liberty to show that there can be an intimate dialectical relationship between individual liberty and this notion of collectivity. I will not go into that, but what I'll say that the party is trying to do and has been trying to do is to ground the legitimacy of its exercise of executive authority in this project of Sinization, and expressly so. And again, I'm saying executive authority, and I mean imperium. So, I will conclude then with some reflections of Fanon, who says in Les Derniers de la Terre, the human condition, the project of humanity, the collaboration between humans for tasks that augment the inclusivity of humankind are new problems requiring real inventions. Let us decide not to imitate Europe, but bend our muscles and brains in a new direction, Let us invent the inclusive humankind, l'homme total. Europe has been incapable of making triumph. The reflections on this remark are not mine, however, but those of a dear friend, the late Ahmed Jdeh. Yes, there's a resonance in the names. Who was a well-known and regarded historian of the contemporary Arab world, as well as a revolutionary activist and well-regarded intellectual from the Tunisian Central Plateau, one of those euphemistically referred to as the youth of the revolution. He shared his reflections with me on a Sunday afternoon in June 2011, which was even hotter than it is here today. And when I say that it was hotter than it is here today, I mean that in multiple senses. As we walked the length of the Avenue Habib Bourguiba, which had become the agora of the revolution, and that was the term they used. هذه الagora, right? And participated in one of its spontaneous symposia, where an intense debate ensued between representatives of Ennahda, I'm assuming right now everybody knows who Ennahda is, and the Popular Front, which you might not know, but it was the coalition of leftist groups that really ought to have been part of the government that was formed in 2016's election, because they won the second largest collection of votes. Oh, Ennahda is, of course, the Islamicist, right? Ghanouchi's party, who came to power in the first popular election, right? And who stayed in power, a little over a year. He said to me, looking at what is happening in Tunisia now, one cannot help but ask how revolutions or revolts, uprisings and insurrections are being born not only in the contemporary Arab and Muslim world, but also elsewhere in the world today. There is clearly an indestructible dream of a better world, to which historians should apply themselves in elucidating. Prompted in good measure by the issues and nature of the debate we just participated in, he paused and remarked that the analysis of Frantz Fanon's made of revolution in Africa while he was residing in Tunisia still served as a template for understanding what is happening now. Now, that remark prompted me to recall Fanon's prominent role in the Algerian Revolution as what I call a craftsman of intelligence. And that's clearly the subtext of this entire talk, that these revolutions are about trying to deal with the formation of ways of being human in the world that have to do with, as Gramsci understood, the relationship between intelligence and its material manifestations in order of society and polity. It also reminded me of the precariousness of the struggle to preserve the indestructible dream of the world against counterforce. I already mentioned the failure of Ban Ramdan. Ban Ramdan was recognized as the architect and dean of the Algerian Revolution from its eruption in November 1954. He was a Mazir from Kabyle. I must say autobiographically, this is sort of cosmic, that's when I was born. And, I've always been told that because I was born into a family politically mixed I even had a Republican uncle, but also then, a Garveyite grandfather. And so leftist discourse was the discourse of the table. And I was told, because, I'm a child of the wars of liberation. These were at the forefront of our conversations. Yeah, you came into existence with Algeria. Wow.
And you're like, I am a country.
No, I hope not. So I already mentioned that failure. Ban Ramadan, who was the architect of the Summam conference that consolidated all the various elements into a particular revolutionary project, had this idea that the prospects of transformation were to come from the people. And it was an idea that the generals who were outside the country in Tunisia disagreed with. He used to call them the potentates. And if you've read Fanon, it's the idea that Fanon shared. Ramadan is the one who brought Fanon into the FLN and the movement. Now, there's been a spate of books in Algeria that have come out in the past 10 years that have uncovered that indeed it was the FLN army that assassinated Ramadan in Morocco and tried to assassinate Fanon. And in that act of assassination, they hijacked the revolutionary project for Arabo-Islamic nationalism. And so what Ramadan and Fanon were conceiving as a global, and I would even say even imperial revolutionary project, becomes a project of national liberation and state constitution, and hence the problematics of sovereignty emerge. Which I think was precisely Juday's point. It also brought to mind, however, his remarks, something Fanon wrote in the field book he kept on his journey to the south to Mali in 1959, which was published in 1964 by Mesparot as Pour la Révolution Africaine, and then published in English in 1969 as Towards the African Revolution. He wrote that the greatest danger for Africa was the absence of ideology. Fanon had in mind the way in which the processes historically entailed in, and perhaps constitutive of, the long momentum of revolutionary bourgeois formation, culminating in the revolution of 1848, engendered a secularization in the colonial context, that rather than precipitating the decline of tribalism and religion, reinforces and extends their application. A more dramatic way of putting it is that the historical effect of revolution's application under imperial colonialism has been to replace old population formations with new ones in accordance with the logic of bourgeoisie formation. That same historical tendency toward hypermanagement, long construed to be the work and tradition of politics and political formation, also pens up vectors of performance of human thinking in action that aren't quite so readily subjugated to the political. Fanon's remark about ideology, nonetheless, can be construed as a call for criticism, a call for judgment. Indeed, it is a call to reimagine the possibilities of secularization through recognizing the tremendous reach of its machines of desire and imagination. It must be underscored, however, that this criticism is not the performance of that which seeks to merely become something in terms of the current conceptual as well as political order of Western modernity. I have one more sentence. Rather, it seeks to compel that order to recognize the full range of forces it has engaged, not as products of that engagement, but as sets of facts and powers and practices, the material existence, historical implementation, and manipulation of which warrant tracing. Such a performance calls on a proper comparative study of all the practices and facts of power in the world today. How else can we even begin to understand things like the Tunisian people's irresistible quest for freedom and dignity in relation to a lineage of radical humanism? This is a question of imagination. Thank you.